Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. It's been a bit of a while since I've been able to sit down and film a YouTube video, but it's not been due to a lack of want, it's just been a really hectic time. It's been really difficult to sort of like sit down and film like a whole long YouTube video just because I haven't had much time, but I have been sort of popping in and out and like sharing little bits of what I've been up to. So you might have seen that I did a bit of work with the International Booker Prize this year. I spent the majority of April and the majority of May just doing a lot of interviews with the International Booker Prize shortlisted translators, which was an incredible experience. And I'm super, super grateful that we were able to make it all happen and fit it all in. So during that time period, it was a lot of reading, prepping for the interviews, editing, uploading them all on like Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and just like making sure to give each of the translators like their flowers and making sure that everyone got their deserved like attention. I really wanted to make sure that everyone appreciated each of the books on the shortlist. So it was a lot of coordination and it was a lot of work on my part, but it was a super, super rewarding task. So I'm really glad that I survived that hectic period. Doing passion projects on top of working my 9 to 5, like it was just wiping me out. And to make matters even more extreme, I'm actually getting married in a week's time. I think by the time I upload this, I'll just be a couple of days away from my wedding, which is really exciting. It's literally taking place next week. And so, yeah, alongside all of the many little plates that I've been spinning, my partner and I have also been prepping for our wedding. So it's been a really, really hectic time, but a very joyous time. And so I'm really happy that today I get to sit down and talk to you about all the books that I've enjoyed reading during this really hectic time. Firstly, I have to say, I have no idea how we're already 6 months into the year. Like, I can't believe how fast the time has absolutely flown by. Being 6 months into the year, I thought that for today's video, I would pick 6 of the best books that I've read all year as like a sort of midway check-in, just to put some new books into your radar and to just talk about all the great books that I've read thus far. So as I mentioned, things have been pretty hectic on my end, which means that I haven't always had time to read. So as of right now, I have read 27 books this year. Now, I'm not someone that really likes to set a reading goal, and I'm not one that, I don't like feeling pressured to read a certain number of books a week, a year, or anything. I think because I spent so long being told what to read and, reading the required reading for my degree, my relationship with reading now is very much an intuitive one. I'm very much like a mood reader, and I'm very much someone that if I'm not in the mood to read, then I won't force myself to read. Like, I'm really trying to work on reading for pleasure and just sort of strengthening my relationship with reading in that way. So because of that, I don't really like setting reading goals. Due to the nature of the reading tracking apps that I use, Goodreads and Storygraph, I have set my goal as 52 books to read this year, which is basically like 1 book a week, but I'm very much not enforcing that. If I get there at the end of the year, that's great. If I don't, that's also okay. So as of right now, I have read 27 books, and 25 of those books are actually fiction novels, and 2 of those books, to my surprise, are nonfiction. I might have mentioned here before, but I am not someone that likes reading nonfiction. It is something that I want to work on, and it is something that I'm trying to do more of, because I think it is very important to widen our reading tastes and to very much read outside of our comfort zones. And like I said, I'm an intuitive reader, I'm a mood reader, so sometimes I really struggle to do that, but I'm working on it. So I think, halfway into the year and I've read 2 nonfiction books, that's not bad. I'm actually listening to 2 nonfiction books at the moment. I've found that the easiest way to get myself to read nonfiction is to do it via audiobook. Don't know if other people feel the same, but I find that I'm able to retain the information a lot better if I've read it via audiobook than if I'm sort of sat down reading it because I will zone out if I'm just reading it on the page. If it's, you know, a little dense, but if I'm listening to it on audio, I seem to just sort of like lock in. Feels like I'm listening to like a podcast or like I'm speaking to someone. At the moment, I'm reading Careless People by Sarah Wynne Williams by audiobook, and I'm having the time of my life with that book. I'm just amazed by everything that's going on there. And I do genuinely think, like, I don't want to get too into it in case they, you know, ban my video for talking about this book. But I will say that all of the like sort of attempts to smear her book and, you know, all the lengths that they're going to stop talking about her book has only made me want to read it more. And I have to say, I'm listening to it on audiobook. It's narrated by her. Brilliant, 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 brilliant story. And I'd also like to preface this video by saying that of the 27 books that I've read so far, so many of them have been really good. I've been really lucky in that I think last year I really struggled to give books 5 stars. I was in a massive 5-star rut. But this year I've just been really lucky in that I've been reading really good books. A lot of the books that I'll be talking about today, I've actually rated 5 stars for many different reasons. And there are other books that I, you know, haven't included in my top 6 that are very, very, very close to being 5 stars and deserve to be shouted about. But for the sake of this video and to, you know, keep it concise, I had to just narrow down my choices to 6 books that I absolutely loved and I think more people should read. So without further ado, let's dive into my top 6 books of 2026. Starting off nice and strong, the first book that I absolutely loved in 2026 is Eating Ashes by Brenda Navarro, which was translated from Spanish by Megan McDowell. This is one of the most excruciatingly beautiful books that I have read in my entire life. Like truly, truly devastating, but also some of like the best writing that I've read in a really long time. So the novel is narrated by an unnamed narrator who is a young woman in her mid-20s who lives in Barcelona, but she is a Mexican immigrant. So she moved there with her family. And the novel begins with the suicide of her younger brother. Happens in the first page, it's not really a spoiler. And what we get is a series of vignettes that sort of narrate her life before, during, and after her brother's suicide. So her brother's death is kind of like the central point for the narrative, but you know, we get to go back to Mexico with them, we see their childhood, then we go back to Barcelona in the present day, and we get to observe her relationships with other people, her relationships with family, her relationships with her brother, her relationships with herself. And then obviously in the present day, you know, we see her grieve and we see her come to terms with everything. And at the same time, you know, she's a young person trying to figure out what to do with their life, what they want to be. So, you know, I'd like to say that it's a novel that starts off with this incident and then it creates like a ripple effect that just talks about so much more. Despite how sad the content is, like I said, I think this is some of the best writing that I've read in a really long time. And so I really enjoyed spending time with this novel, and I really enjoyed just dissecting the beauty in the language and the way the sentences were constructed and the way the story is told. I thought that this was absolutely beautiful, devastating as it is. Go into it expecting this family drama or this family sort of saga, and then what you get is like this whole exploration of the immigrant experience in Europe. We learn about the mistreatment of Mexican and other Latin American immigrants in Spain. We also learn about the gender violence and about the misogyny and about femicide that's happening in Mexico and, you know, partly influencing why they left in the first place. We also learn about the sort of intergenerational family wounds that like the narrator's mum and her grandmother carry, and that's something that they sort of pass down to her. We learn about the violence from unbroken family cycles, from the racism that she endures, from the systemic violence she also endures. Then obviously, you know, the violence from the lack of closure because of her brother's suicide. So, you know, I feel like I'm not selling it very well because I'm making it sound so sad, but truly I feel like these are just themes that I think we need to explore more. in literature. And I think that for me, this book is a really good conversation starter. It really got me thinking about things. And, I could really empathize with the narrator, being a Latin American immigrant myself. And so a lot of the things that were unearthed in this novel were things that really moved me. And so I just think that this is absolutely beautiful, and I'm really excited to read more of Brenda Navarro's work. Similarly, last year I read a book called From Savagery by Alejandra Banca, translated from Spanish by Katie Brown. And this book is similar in the sense that it revolves around Venezuelan immigrants who live in Barcelona, and it sort of details their experiences as Venezuelan and Latin American immigrants living in Spain, and again, kind of looking at the racism and the systemic violence that they endure, about, finding community and the necessity for community. It also explores, the sadness or how torn they feel with the fact that they live in Barcelona, they're creating a new life for themselves in Barcelona, but then obviously, they've got their family back home, and how, they no longer really fit back home, but they no longer really fit here either. So I thought it was really fun because this is a collection of short stories, but they're all interconnected because all of the different Venezuelan characters kind of know each other or have come across each other before, and it all sort of comes together in the end, which is something that I really enjoyed. Really happy that more and more people are starting to write about, the immigrant experiences, especially Latin American immigrants in Europe. Both of those books touch on this, and I hope in the future we'll get more novels that touch on this also. Much to everyone's surprise, a non-fiction book on my top 6. I know, who would have thought it? Not me.
Look at us, huh? Who would have thought? Not me.
Let it be said that this is an absolutely excellent novel, and I am beyond glad that I read it. Everything is Tuberculosis is an absolute powerhouse of a book. John Green, the author of, The Fault in Our Stars, Looking for Alaska, all of these books that I grew up reading, he takes us through the history of the disease, from how people used to think about it back in the day and even romanticize it, to early medical studies and how people used to try and treat it back in the day, to then he takes us to the present day, and then he takes us to a real life case of a young boy from Sierra Leone named Henry Ryder, who is threaded throughout the whole novel in between these chapters about the history of tuberculosis. He brings us back to the present day to talk to us about what's happening in Sierra Leone, and talking to us about Henry, who has tuberculosis. Something that I absolutely adored about this book is the level of research and depth that John Green went into when writing this book. You can tell that this is a special interest for him, and you can tell how much love and care went into this novel. I have to say that this book is just explained in such an accessible way, and something that I just found absolutely incredible is all of the statistics. I feel like I was reading this book and I had to keep coming out of it to tell my partner, to tell my colleagues, to tell customers, hey, did you know blah, 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 blah about tuberculosis? And I was just, I couldn't wrap my head around the number of facts that I was learning about this, because some of them are just truly mind-blowing. According to John Green, over 1.3 million people have died from tuberculosis in 2025. But that number could have been reduced to 0 if people had access to this treatment. And something I didn't know prior to reading this book is that they actually found the cure to tuberculosis in the 1950s. I had no idea that this disease was curable until I read this book. I think more and more people are starting to talk about pharmaceuticals and big pharma companies in the States, and how, it's all about money and it's not really about curing people. I don't want to sound like a bit conspiracist, because this is an area that I am not well informed in. But according to John Green, if people chose to distribute the cure, tuberculosis could be completely wiped out altogether. So as I mentioned, the novel starts with the sort of history and societal views and early cases, etc. But really at the heart of this novel is Henry's story. And John Green ultimately illustrates that Henry's disease could have been cured, could have been prevented had he been born in another part of the world. So I'm going to read you a quote from the text that I just, was one of my biggest takeaways from this book. The root cause of tuberculosis is injustice. In a world where everyone can eat, access healthcare, and be treated humanely, tuberculosis has no chance. Ultimately, we are the cause, but we must also be the cure. So ultimately, through this novel, I learned so much about systemic racism within healthcare. I learned so much about poverty and inequality and how that affects people's access to healthcare. I am truly so grateful that I read this book. And I think that it's one that everyone should read. And I don't say this lightly. I think that everyone could take something away from this book. I mean, take it from me. I'm not someone that's really into nonfiction, and I have taken away so many things that I have shared with other people that I am constantly thinking about now, and I'm constantly sort of mindful of and aware of purely from reading this book. I've also written down some statistics that I could not wrap my head around. So to wrap up this review, I would love to share them with you all. Since the beginning of time, 1 in 7 people that have ever lived have died of tuberculosis. Or in 2023, more people died of tuberculosis than casualties from malaria, typhoid, and war combined. Another quote, which I think is insane. Between 1985 and 2005, roughly as many people died of tuberculosis than in World War I and World War II combined. Again, what is happening? And then lastly, this is the most important quote, and I think that it's the perfect one to wrap up this book. The last quote is, "A child born in Sierra Leone is 100 times more likely to die of tuberculosis than a child born in the United States. This difference is not caused by genetics, biology, or culture. Health inequalities are caused by poverty, racism, lack of medical care, and other social forces." So, as John Green illustrates, we are the cause, but we can also be the cure. Next up is a book that I've actually spoken on this channel about before. The next book is She Who Remains by Renee Carabash, translated by Isadora Angel. So a while back when I was putting together my International Book Prize predictions video, I spoke about this book, which I read earlier this year, and I absolutely adored this. Even though I've already reviewed this book, I couldn't do a faithful top 6 video if I didn't include this, because I have truly not stopped thinking about this book since I read it. And it's actually one of my most hand-sold books at the bookshop. Like, it's just a book that I am dying to put into people's hands because I just want more and more people to talk about it with. And I just think that this is such a phenomenal book. If you'd like to see my full review for it, I will link the video in this video as well. But I just had to include it because it's such a phenomenal book. And, you know, I had the absolute pleasure of meeting Renee and Isadora when they came over for the International Booker Prize tour, and just meeting them in person and getting to talk about the book in depth, and, you know, getting to interview Isadora especially, and learning about the process and how difficult it was to bring this book from Bulgarian over into English, and the many decisions that it took to bring it over into English, like, just gave me a whole new appreciation for the novel. I just truly think that, you know, if there's one book that you absolutely have to read this year, it should be this one. It's a short one, you have no excuse, but it's absolutely phenomenal, and I think more people should read it. This book was an absolute dark horse for me. So one thing about me is I am a chronic big book avoider. I do not like big books, which I know is really controversial, and I'm really, really trying to work on it. But if it's anything over 500 pages, I just won't want to read it. I'm sorry. Obviously, I make exceptions for, you know, The Goldfinch, which is about 900 and something pages, or The Duke, which was almost 600 pages. So I do make exceptions from time to time, but ultimately takes a lot of convincing. It's partly why I haven't read many classics, to be honest, because I'm just not into big books. However, this next book, which I don't have a physical copy of because the paperback is coming out in a couple of days, so I'm just going to put it up on the screen here. The next book that I'm talking about is The Remembered Soldier by Anjet Danye, translated by David McKay. I was essentially bullied into reading this book. Partly, you know, my friend JC, he has been trying to get me to read this book for months. Like, I'm talking about last year, prior to it being longlisted for the International Booker Prize, he was pressuring me, peer pressuring me into reading this book. And me not being into big books, I just kept putting it off and putting it off. And once I saw that it had been longlisted for the International Booker, I thought, oh, I've got to read it now. But I am truly upset at the thought of what would my life have been like if I hadn't read this book. And I know it sounds really dramatic, but that's how much this book has impacted me. That is how much I love this book, that I'm sad at the thought of, me hating big books would have prevented me from reading this, because this book is just truly phenomenal. So I'm so grateful that I read it. I'm so grateful that my friend bullied me into reading this. I'm so grateful that it was longlisted for the International Booker Prize. I truly think that The Remembered Soldier is one of the best books of the 21st century, like period, that has ever been written. I think it is sensational. I feel a bit awkward because I don't have like a physical copy, so I'm just sort of like using my hands a lot, but I don't want to pretend to be holding the book either. Anyways, so where do I start? Okay. The Remembered Soldier takes place in Belgium, and it starts with, we're in an asylum, in a mental health facility, and we have a soldier who doesn't remember his name, doesn't remember his life. He doesn't remember being in the war. He is suffering from PTSD. And so, he gets flashbacks of being in the trenches and killing people, but he doesn't really have any memory of anything before or sort of after that. And the novel starts, and this isn't a spoiler, but the novel starts with an ad that's been put out in the paper where they're looking for his family. And a woman comes in and basically says, I am your wife, let's go home now. So that's how the novel starts. I'm not giving anything away, but essentially then what ensues is, I guess, this chronicle of what life was like after the war. Now, I'm not someone that reads a lot of war or soldier stories or that sort of like historical fiction. So for me, this was an entirely new concept. But I feel like so much of historical fiction narratives, especially World War I narratives, revolve around the soldiers in the trenches, killing people and what was happening there. But you never really hear about the people that were left behind, or you never really hear about how people made ends meet. Like, I never really thought about the families, the women, the mothers who kind of had to stay behind while their husbands and fathers went away to fight in this war. So I found that to be really interesting. So that's how the novel starts. And then, we start to unravel certain things. There are a lot of questions about identity. There are a lot of questions about sort of how the nation repairs itself or tries to deal with the war. How is it trying to, help the economy back together? What is the nation doing to support veterans? Or is the nation doing anything to support widows or families whose soldiers didn't come back? So, there's a lot of stuff that's like being unraveled and talked about here. But ultimately, at the very root, we get this very intimate portrait of a marriage, and we get this very intimate portrait of this relationship between, this wife that waited a long time to be reunited with her husband, and then her husband who is essentially a stranger. He has no recollection of who he is or what his life was like before. And so, we get this like very, very beautiful portrayal of, I guess, falling in love and this bond between two people amidst the absolute horrors of the war. Because ultimately, it's not like he left the asylum and he's absolutely fine. He is suffering from PTSD. And this was a time where, I don't believe PTSD was really spoken about. There's a big stigma in the novel when he has episodes or, when he is having flashbacks and he's in a public space. I think, that this novel tackles so many interesting themes. I absolutely love historical novels. I love learning when I read. It's something that I love getting a book and I love learning about, a new culture or a new aspect of history or a new perspective that I might not have otherwise considered. For me, reading allows me to step into the shoes of so many different people, so many different lives. So I really enjoyed reading this novel and doing that. And obviously it's 700 and something pages long. And I don't know, I wish in a way that I had more, because, you know, by the time it ended, I was like, I need more. You know, you spend so long with these characters, you become so invested that you just want more. What I admired most about this novel is that it really leans into this whole like unreliable narrator, the ethics of storytelling and like rewriting history. And I have to say, like, as well as it being this historical fiction novel and this historical narrative, it's also just so well written. It's absolutely beautiful. When I first started reading it, I was like nearly 200 pages in. And I didn't realize that I'd read so much, because you just sort of flow into it. It's, you know, it's narrated in the first person. You're in the soldier's head. You only really hear what he's thinking. You only get other people's perspectives if they've said something out loud. So again, it brings up all these like little questions, and ultimately, like, I just think it's incredible. It's such a beautiful novel. And I'm very excited because Anjit Danye has another novel that's coming out in October in the UK. I believe it's already out in the US. So I am actually really excited to read that one. It looks like another doorstopper. It looks like it's going to be another 700 pager. However, I am really excited to give her another go, just because I enjoyed The Remembered Soldier so much and I really liked her writing style. And I thought as well that David McKay's translation was phenomenal. Like, I just thought it was beautifully written, and I'm really excited to read her next book. The UK is having one of its infamous heat waves, and we are struggling. We are suffering in the UK. It is so hot. Not fun times right now. But actually, heatwave allowing, this leads me very nicely into the next book that I'm talking about, which is Before the Rocket by Loran Vella, translated by Kat Storis. So this novel is a little bit of everything. It's a bit of a climate crisis novel, hence the heatwave, with some speculative fiction, with science fiction. It's also like a love letter to photography and to art making. It's also a family saga, and it's talking a lot about intergenerational families and the things that we pass down to one another. And then also it's a historical fiction novel that explores the Italian colonization of Malta. So this is a book with a lot of bite. It really talks about absolutely everything. Before the Rocket begins with a young boy named Petrol, who is being raised by his grandmother, Rika. Now, Rika is a professional photographer by trade, so Petrol has a bit of an unconventional childhood in that he's traveling around the world, just, you know, following his grandmother, taking photos of here, there, and everywhere. But what's interesting for me is that Rika and Petrol never stand in front of the camera because they believe themselves to be cursed, in the sense of, you know, there's a few instances where they take pictures of people, or they take pictures of sort of tourists, and then they'll mysteriously pass away, or something bad will happen. And so, you know, Rika and Petrol refuse to stand in front of the lens, and, you know, they never take photos together, which is just like an added mystery to the story. The novel is also set in 2064, so it's set in the near to distant future, and it takes place in a Malta where there's waves that are sort of destroying and eating away at the island. It's unbearably hot. You know, there's a climate crisis going on. The island is deteriorating. And essentially, the Italian regime has colonized Malta, and they've turned the island into a space exploration program. The best way that I can describe this novel is it's a little bit like Interstellar meets Dune, meets The Palace on the Higher Hill, meets 100 Years of Solitude, meets On the Calculation of Volume. Yeah, I have to say, like, I think a lot of the picks that I've picked so far are sort of very experimental, or they're ones where, you know, there's such like fun concepts or characters that are playing around that I really enjoyed spending time with a novel. And this is another novel that I found it difficult to part with, just because I was really enjoying the sort of journey. I should also say that Before the Rocket is published by Praspar Press, who are an independent press based in the UK that specialise in publishing Maltese literature and distributing it to Anglophone readers. So this was actually the first Maltese book that I've ever read, and I don't want it to be my last. I really, really enjoyed it, and I love that it's sort of depicting the Mediterranean in a new way. It's sort of moving away from this idyllic paradise kind of depiction of the Med, which is just so common in contemporary literature. So I thought that this was a really fun, sort of mind-bending novel. I love the different use of genres. I loved a lot of the characters in this, and I loved getting to learn more about Maltese history and about these like universal themes about the state of the world or family and the things we pass down. And, then there's like a whole fun time twist warping thing going on too. So yeah, this novel was just a lot of fun. I also had the absolute privilege of talking to Kat about her translation process for this book, which is just absolutely fascinating. And I just really, really enjoyed getting to pick her brains, because we read this book for my translated fiction book club, and a lot of members really enjoyed it, but a lot of members were, trying to wrap their heads around like the whole time warping things going on. And so I think like this is a really good book to discuss with a group. I guess, getting to speak to Kat about it just helped me to wrap my head around it a little bit more and really just appreciate her work all the much more. I had a lot of fun reading this, and I can't wait to see what other books Praspa Press publish next. So my final book for the top 6 books I've read all year is The Love of Singular Men by Victor Heringer, translated by James Young. This is set in 1970s Brazil, and it's a queer coming-of-age story, and it's narrated by this young boy who is not able-bodied, and so he's kind of, he spends his summers just sort of sitting on the sidelines watching the other kids, and, he feels like an outcast and like he doesn't really fit in. That is until his father drops off a young boy in his house who's the same age as him, and then sort of like a relationship ensues. And alongside that, something tragic happens, and so, we hear from this young boy looking back in his childhood, but then he takes us back to the present day where he's still grieving and he's still processing what happened, and he's still trying to wrap his head around it. You get the feeling that our narrator is someone who has never moved on from this, and he's someone who has let this trauma sort of define the rest of his life, the trajectory of his life and how he's lived. And so you get this child's perspective, you get this adult's perspective, and it's sort of jumping back and forward, but it's also very experimental. I really enjoyed that throughout the novel there are little symbols. Let me see if I can find one. There are also photos, so there are like stamps and genuine photographs from things that these are photographs that the author provided himself, or there are photographs from TV screens and things that they're talking about. There are also little doodles throughout, and the symbols that I'm trying to find, every time that they mention the sun, there's like a little sun symbol. Yeah, there you go. There's like little suns and little symbols. This novel is absolutely beautiful, heartbreaking, devastating. I think, if you like stories like Call Me By Your Name or Lie With Me, basically like queer coming of age love stories where, it talks about like that first love and that first experience and, growing up. I think those kinds of novels, I really enjoy reading those novels. So, if you like those, then I think you'll like this. Something I really liked about this also, it's set amidst the backdrop of the 1976 dictatorship. I guess it's a more subtle exploration. It's not really in your face, but there are things that lead you to believe that maybe the boy's father is part of the military dictatorship, and that maybe this boy is somehow linked to that. And, there's a lot that is not explored. There's a lot that is left unsaid, but I think that it's really interesting to read a novel that's sort of set amidst that. And, more recently, I went to see the film The Secret Agent, which I thought was phenomenal. I think it was robbed of the Oscar because it was so, so, so good. Yeah, I really love reading dictatorship pieces set in South America or Latin America generally. I love seeing how different authors and different countries sort of deal with the exploration of the long-term felt effects of the dictatorship. I really like that. That's just more of like a nerdy thing for me that I really enjoyed. But I think that, yeah, this is such a phenomenal piece of fiction, and I am not only grieving the fact that I finished it, but I'm grieving the fact that I won't get to read a piece of fiction by this author again. Like I said, unless I learn Portuguese. There are some explorations in here that just kind of took my breath away, from the way that they're written to the things that they're talking about. You know, there are passages about philosophy, and there are passages about, you know, the way we think about life. There are passages about the way that we perceive, for example, our classmates. And it goes back to the novel being experimental and using all of these like pictures and symbols and things. I thought that, yeah, that this novel captured what it's like to be a kid and what it's like to be experiencing all these things, and, you know, looking back. And I guess it explores the infallibility of memory also. You know, he's looking back, how reliable is he as a narrator? All of these things that it does in such like a tiny novel. I would definitely say it's a definition of small but packs a punch. And I think that this is just, yeah, a phenomenal novel that I want more people to be talking about. I want more people to be reading. So yeah. So this concludes my top 6 books of the year. I had a lot of fun sitting down and thinking about, you know, what constitutes like a top 6 book for me, and what did I enjoy about this, or what is it that I can't stop thinking about. And, you know, it really forced me to sit down and reflect on my reading habits. And like I said, I've been really fortunate in that I've had a lot of 5-star and really great book reads recently in the 27 books that I've read this year. So I'm really excited to sort of check in and see in 6 months' time what books will come up in my top 6, or, you know, I might end up doing like a top 12 books of the year. So yeah, I'm really excited to see how many more great books I manage to read by then. Thank you so much again for watching, and thank you so much for all of your support. I will be back in a couple of weeks, so I will see you on the other side.